A former Oklahoma City police officer is facing life in prison for the serial rapes of African-American women. An all-white jury convicted Daniel Holtzclaw last week of rape and other crimes against 8 of the 13 women who accused him.
2017, she met a guy on a dating app and they went out for pizza. That he was a Cleveland police officer cadet put her at ease.
It makes you feel safe knowing that you're meeting someone who's a police officer. He followed behind me and ripped my shirt from around my throat and strangled me to the point that my shirt ripped. I had burn marks on my throat. He ripped my underwear off from me.
She didn't know his last name, but says the rookie police officer had distinctive features.
As a former RPD officer receives his punishment for raping a child under 15. Gio Battaglia brings us the details from inside the courtroom.
Sean Jordan was sentenced by Ontario County Court Judge Christine Carley to serve 10 weekends in jail and 10 years probation.
Sexual assault is one of the most common forms of police violence across the country. So common, in fact, that a local news agency in New York found that over a 10-year period, a police officer was arrested for sexual assault at least every 5 days. Welcome back to I Think You Should Know This, and today we're continuing my series on gender-based violence perpetrated by law enforcement. Thank you for your patience in me getting this next video up. It has been a very wonky month for me, but I am very excited to continue this series. Last video, we spoke about how common and pervasive domestic abuse is amongst police officers. Today, we'll be covering sexual assault perpetrated by law enforcement. We'll cover the lack of news coverage when it's police officers who are accused of sexual assault, what happens to police officers when they are in fact charged with crimes related to sexual violence, and most importantly, in my opinion, the Law Enforcement Consent Loophole, which allows for cops in almost half of US states to get away with sexually assaulting those in their detention. If you are interested in learning about current events, especially those related to policing, please go ahead and like and subscribe to not miss my next video. So as I mentioned at the start of this video, the local news agency Buffalo News in New York State has done some incredible work on this issue, finding nationwide over the course of a 10-year period that a police officer was arrested for sexual assault at least every 5 days. And the at least in there means that in many cases, it was actually less than 5 days between arrests. When we think about perpetration rates, though, it's important to remember that this statistic is talking about arrests, not actual rates of perpetration or even reports. For very understandable reasons, many people who've experienced sexual assault by law enforcement don't really feel like reporting their assault to law enforcement. Remember, all forms of gender-based violence are underreported, and it's hard to imagine reporting your experience of sexual assault to the very people who have sexually assaulted you. When it comes to news coverage of these cases, though, I rely almost exclusively on small local journalists covering cases in their area. Without local news agencies doing the tough work of keeping track of these cases, we likely would have absolutely no idea the state of sexual violence by cops in America. Mainstream news coverage on this issue is hard to come by. And I have pitched it to so many news agencies that have replied to me saying, hey, this sounds really important, but we're not going to cover it. News sites like the New York Times, The Atlantic, Huffington Post, and cable news agencies like CNN, MSNBC, or Fox News don't often cover sexual assault cases when it's a cop who sexually assaulted someone. I will say ProPublica and the Washington Post have done some incredible journalism on the issue. The Washington Post has actually been keeping track of police officers who are accused of sexually assaulting children, which I will cover in my next video. As someone who researches this issue day in and day out, one of my biggest journalistic pet peeves is when I'm reading about a sexual assault case and then buried way down at the bottom, finally you find out the guy is a police officer. Or like just recently I was reading this case out of Connecticut and I had to read a paragraph upon a paragraph about how this cop was actually a really fantastic, amazing guy. Buried at the bottom, mind you, you find out that he raped, threatened to kill, harassed, and stalked the mother of one of his 5 children. Feel like we really buried the lead there. A common occurrence of sexual assault by law enforcement is the coercion of women into sex acts to avoid arrest. In these instances, a cop will find some type of reason to accuse a woman of acting illegally and then tell them if they engage in a variety of sex acts, the cop will release them without arrest. In a very recent case, actually, in Illinois, a cop stopped a woman who was walking in the dark without a light, which isn't illegal, and he is accused of fabricating the discovery of a bottle of pills in her pocket. He told her that if she came in his patrol car and they went behind a building, they could take care of business and then he would let her go. He proceeded to force her to perform oral sex and then released her. In Kansas City, the police department is accused of targeting and raping Black women for decades. And while police sexual violence can happen to anyone, it's important to always remember that Black people are disproportionately impacted by police violence. These women, who may or may not have been struggling with substance use, would be detained by police and forced to perform sex acts to maintain their freedom. And let's be clear, rape is not a punishment for using drugs. I don't actually care if someone has engaged in some type of illegal activity. They still shouldn't be sexually assaulted by the police. So what happens when cops have actually been charged with a crime related to sexually assaulting someone? Well, it depends. And it depends really on the police's willingness to investigate, the DA's commitment to actually litigating the case, and the survivor's desire to testify in court. And for really understandable reasons, people are petrified to have to talk about their experience of sexual assault in front of the person that sexually assaulted them, let alone the potential fear, harassment, or retaliation that may come with that person being a police officer. In some cases, like this one in Texas, a police officer was found guilty of raping a woman and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. And there are definitely others like it, where the police abusing their authority to rape community members was taken seriously. But there are also plenty of cases where the officer is given probation, like this one. And this one, and this one, and this one. You get the point. I could do this all day. And in some cases, while an officer isn't let off with probation alone, they are given abysmal and insulting prison sentences. This cop in New York State pled guilty to raping a 13-year-old girl and was given 10 weekends in jail. 10 weekends. Not weeks, weekends. And of course, there are a lot of cases where a cop is found not guilty or the charges are dropped against them because of a deeply antiquated, deeply problematic pitfall of the legal system, which leads me to the Law Enforcement Consent Loophole. Now, I have spoken a little bit about the Law Enforcement Consent Loophole on my TikTok, and it has definitely sparked a lot of discussion. So first things first, what is it? Well, in almost half of US states, there are no state laws prohibiting a police officer from engaging in sexual activity with those in their detention. What that means is, as long as that cop claims that that activity was consensual, then there really is no legal standing to hold them accountable. And many experts in the law, gender-based violence, and civil rights all say that someone can't freely consent if they are in police custody, which you'd think would be kind of a no-brainer, but you'd be surprised the comments I've gotten. Oh, well, what if she just really, really wanted it? Is it still the cop's fault? You've been watching too much porn. Get off the internet. A case that I often resort back to when I'm talking about how the law enforcement consent loophole still works these days is from, I believe, 2023 in Missouri. The case really goes as follows. A woman was getting drunk with her friend at the casino, which is her right and sounds fun as fuck. And she got so drunk that the casino staff was actually like, hey, we're cutting y'all off. You gotta go get a ride home. She is so drunk that she is actually seen on the casino's security footage, like stumbling into walls and into furniture. And when she exited the casino for whatever reason, which is for some reason pretty common in highly trafficked areas at night, there was just a group of cops hanging out outside on the street. She says that she remembers thinking that this cop could take her home and that she would be safe because it's a police officer. Mind you, that cop is seen on his own body camera footage looking up the penal code for rape. She doesn't remember most of the night, but her brother, who she was living with at the time, says that the cop brought her home and he walked in on her sister being assaulted. The brother was like, whoa, 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 clearly my sister is not okay. What the fuck? She ended up reporting to the police about the encounter when she spoke to her brother about what happened. And it's really sad because she's repeatedly said that it's her fault because she doesn't remember really any of the night, which anybody with an elementary understanding of consent should know that that means that she was too intoxicated to have sex, let alone someone who had just looked up the penal code for rape. Anyways, that cop was initially arrested for sexual assault, but the prosecutor declined to press charges because it, quote, could have been consensual, which since when is the standard for consent? Well, it could have been. And that's really how the law enforcement consent loophole is used in practice these days. Because there was no law in Missouri prohibiting sexual activity from police with those in their detention, the cop was able to say, well, it could have been consensual. And the charges were dropped. Now, when I spoke about this on TikTok, there were a few people who did a cursory Google who were trying to prove me wrong. And if you do Google the law enforcement consent loophole, you'll often find a congressional bill that was passed by Congress to close the law enforcement consent loophole for federal law enforcement. Unfortunately, you and I on a daily basis are far more likely to interact with state law enforcement that this bill does not cover. That bill does not close any loophole for state police, and you are far more likely to engage with state police than federal law enforcement. If you're curious of whether or not your state has a law on the books prohibiting sexual activity between law enforcement and those in their detention, I highly recommend looking up your own state's legislation. And if you can't find anything, it's probably because there isn't anything. I'm gonna wrap this video up here. Please let me know if you have any questions about anything that I covered in this video, and I'll be back for my last video in this series covering child sexual abuse by law enforcement. In the meantime, let me know if you need anything. My email's there, my TikTok's there, my Instagram's there. Yeah, okay. Love you, bye.